Ladies and gentlemen, have you ever noticed how some people walk into a room and their presence fills every corner with noise? They speak loudly, boast confidently, and sometimes their words are like armor. Armor that hides insecurities, weaknesses, and an ego that needs constant validation. When they expect you to react, when they want to provoke you into a confrontation, give them nothing. Speak nothing. Let your silence be a mirror that reflects their own behavior, a silent but potent response. You see, their ego thrives on reactions. It feeds on the words we speak, the emotions we display, the attention we give them, and when we refuse to engage, when we step back and remain calm, when we do not play into their need for recognition, we show them the truth they often cannot bear to see. Their ego has no power without your participation. Think about it. In a world where everyone is rushing to be heard, to be seen, to prove they are right, silence becomes a form of strength. It takes more courage to hold your tongue than to lash out in anger. It takes more wisdom to listen, to observe, and to recognize that not every battle needs a word. Not every moment needs a reaction. There is grace in silence. There is power in peace. And when you remain silent in the face of ego, you stand taller than any words ever could. You see, the ego feeds on conflict. It thrives in environments of tension and discord. But your silence, your refusal to engage, is the calm that exposes its fragility. You don't need to tear it down with force. You only need to stop giving it the attention it craves. In your quiet, you begin to see who is truly strong, who is truly secure. And I promise you, those who depend on ego are often the ones who are afraid of the silence you bring. So don't let anyone's noise disturb your peace. Let their words fall away like leaves in the wind. You don't need to shout to be heard. You don't need to engage to be understood. Remember, only your silence will destroy their ego. Choose peace. Choose calm. Choose silence. Silence, often viewed as the absence of sound or communication, carries within it immense power, especially when it is used as a response to ego. It's a force that, when wielded correctly, can dismantle the greatest of egos without a single word being spoken. In a world where noise, both literal and figurative, fills the air, silence stands as a defiant force, offering a profound alternative to the chaotic, attention-seeking tendencies that many people with inflated egos display. To truly understand how silence can become such a powerful response, one must look beyond the surface of what silence is and delve into its deeper implications. In many cultures, silence is seen as a sign of respect or humility. It is often associated with wisdom, as the act of listening, an essential aspect of silence, leads to deeper understanding. But in the context of dealing with ego, silence takes on a more active role. The ego thrives on validation, recognition, and reactions. It feeds on attention, and when it does not receive this, it withers. Silence, in this case, becomes the most powerful tool in removing the fuel that keeps the ego burning. It's not the silence of avoidance, nor the silence of weakness, but the silence of choice, the conscious decision to withhold engagement, to step away from the drama, and to not participate in the amplification of someone else's ego. Ego, by its very nature, seeks external validation. It is concerned with how others perceive it, with how much admiration and respect it can accumulate. When someone with an inflated ego speaks, they often speak not to communicate, but to assert dominance, to establish control, or to make their presence known. These individuals may use their words, their actions, or their gestures as weapons to garner attention and affirmation. It is a constant need to prove themselves, to assert their superiority. When faced with such individuals, most people feel the instinctual need to respond, to defend themselves, or to counter the ego with their own words. This, however, plays right into the hands of the ego, as it thrives on this very engagement. It delights in the back and forth, in the conflict, in the struggle for supremacy. But what happens when there is no response? What happens when the words of the ego fall upon deaf ears? When the provocations go unnoticed? The ego is deprived of its fuel. It begins to weaken, unable to sustain itself without the attention and validation it desperately craves. The silence that is offered in return becomes a mirror, reflecting back the emptiness of the ego's attempts to draw attention. It no longer has anything to cling to, and in this void, the ego's grip loosens. The real power of silence is not just in the absence of noise, but in its ability to shift the balance of power. When an individual chooses to remain silent in the face of an ego-driven interaction, they reclaim control. The ego thrives on conflict, but silence doesn't create conflict. Instead, it creates space, a space where the ego is left alone with its insecurities. The more it seeks recognition, the more it is met with nothing, and this nothingness forces the ego to confront itself. It is a humbling experience. Silence does not need to shout down the ego. It only needs to withhold the validation it seeks. In that withholding, the ego begins to unravel. The longer the silence persists, the more vulnerable the ego becomes. Without reaction, it cannot assert its dominance, and without validation, it cannot thrive. This is the essence of why silence is so powerful when dealing with the ego. It doesn't attack, it simply refuses to engage. When silence is used in response to ego, it also demonstrates a remarkable level of self-awareness and strength. It requires far more emotional intelligence and inner calm to remain silent in the face of provocation than to lash out. To respond with silence is to show that one is not driven by the need to prove anything, to be right, or to elevate oneself above others. It is an act of self-control, a demonstration of maturity and confidence. Those who use silence effectively recognize that their value does not depend on the approval of others or on engaging in power struggles. They are grounded in who they are. And they know that responding to ego-driven behavior would only distract from their own peace and integrity. The silence that comes from a place of inner strength is profound because it reveals an individual who is not controlled by external forces, but who has mastered their own emotions and reactions. There is also something deeply transformative about the act of choosing silence in the face of ego. The more one practices this response, the more one develops the capacity for inner peace. The ego thrives in environments where there is turmoil, where there are constant battles to be won, where people are constantly striving for recognition. Silence, on the other hand, creates a sense of calm. It allows an individual to step outside the noise and to observe from a place of clarity. In this space, one can see that the ego's attempts to draw attention or provoke are often based on fear, insecurity, or a deep need for approval. By choosing silence, one denies the ego the opportunity to manifest its destructive behaviors. It's as though the ego's strategies are rendered ineffective because they cannot function without the external validation they require. What's even more interesting is that silence often creates a greater impact than words ever could. There is a certain weight to silence. When someone chooses to remain silent, especially in a situation where a response is expected, it speaks volumes. Words may be forgotten or misunderstood, but silence carries with it a certain authority. It is an unspoken message that cannot be easily ignored. In the context of ego, silence sends a message of power, of confidence, and of refusal to engage in petty struggles for superiority. It's a message that says, I don't need to participate in your game. And when silence is chosen repeatedly, it can shift the dynamics of the relationship, causing the person with the inflated ego to question their own behavior. Over time, silence reveals the futility of seeking external validation and exposes the fragility of the ego itself. One might argue that silence can be interpreted as weakness or avoidance, but this is a misunderstanding of what silence truly represents. True silence is not avoidance. It is a conscious decision to not give energy to something that does not deserve it. It is an assertion of boundaries, a way of saying, I will not allow my peace to be disturbed by your need for attention. It is a reflection of self-respect. The ego, on the other hand, requires constant feeding, and when it is denied this, it begins to shrivel. Silence is the ultimate tool in this process. It cuts through the noise and reduces the power of the ego to nothing more than empty words and gestures. The beauty of silence is that it is available to everyone. It does not require special skills or knowledge. It is a simple yet profound act, accessible in any situation, and it allows one to navigate through the noise of the world without becoming entangled in it. While others may engage in the cycle of conflict and validation, those who choose silence stand apart, above the fray. In a world that values loudness, silence becomes a quiet act of defiance. It is an act of power, of control, and of profound understanding. One of the key characteristics of the ego is that it is heavily dependent on external feedback. It does not find its strength from within, but instead from what others say, think, or believe about it. The more it is validated, the stronger it becomes. The more it is admired, the larger it grows. It wants to be seen, to be praised, and to be placed on a pedestal. This desire for external validation can be observed in almost every aspect of human life, from social interactions to professional environments and even within personal relationships. The ego operates like a constant search for affirmation, and this is where it draws its power from. One of the most effective ways to weaken the grip of the ego is to withhold reactions. When someone with a strong ego is met with indifference, with a lack of response, it disrupts their cycle of seeking validation. They are no longer able to feed off the reactions they have come to expect. The more a person relies on the ego for their sense of self-worth, the more they need others to mirror that validation. This need creates a cycle of dependency where the ego cannot survive without constant external attention. When you choose not to react to the ego's behavior, whether it is an attempt to assert dominance, provoke, or seek approval, you disrupt this cycle. By withholding your reaction, you remove the source of the ego's strength. The ego no longer has the feedback loop it depends on to validate its existence. Instead of responding with defensiveness or aggression, choosing to stay silent or unresponsive creates a void for the ego. It's as if the ego has no audience to perform for, no one to affirm its greatness. In this void, the ego begins to question its worth, its power, and its importance. This lack of engagement forces the ego to face a harsh reality. Without constant recognition, it becomes irrelevant. The ego's foundation is built on reactions, whether positive or negative. By denying the ego the reactions it craves, you weaken its power. The longer this silence persists, the more fragile the ego becomes. It can only sustain itself for so long before it begins to crumble under the weight of its own emptiness. The ego seeks reactions because they give it a sense of control. In any given interaction, the ego wants to dictate the tone, the mood, and the outcome. It wants to dominate the conversation, to steer the attention toward itself, and to be the focal point of the exchange. When the ego is ignored, it loses its control, and this loss can be deeply unsettling for it. The more it tries to provoke a response, the more it reveals its insecurities. The act of withholding a reaction shows that the ego is not as powerful as it believes itself to be. It exposes the fragility of the ego's need for validation and makes clear that the ego is incapable of controlling the situation without the help of external validation. This principle is particularly evident in situations where individuals try to assert their superiority over others. Someone with a strong ego might try to belittle or insult others, attempting to elevate themselves by making others feel small. In these moments, the instinctual reaction is often to fight back, to defend oneself, or to retaliate. However, by engaging in this back and forth, you feed the ego's need for conflict. You give it the attention it seeks. And in doing so, you participate in strengthening its power. But when you choose not to react, the ego is left with nothing. It is unable to gain the upper hand because its only means of asserting dominance, provoking a reaction, is cut off. Furthermore, ego-driven people often feed off emotional reactions. They seek to provoke anger, frustration, or even jealousy. These emotional responses affirm their sense of power, as they believe that if they can get a rise out of you, they have control over you. When you withhold these reactions, the ego is left with no ammunition. Its attempts to provoke you fall flat, and in doing so, it begins to question its effectiveness. It begins to question whether it can continue to operate in the same way. By choosing not to react to the ego's provocations, you force the ego to face its own limitations. This process, though subtle, is incredibly powerful. The ego's dependence on reactions is what makes it so vulnerable. When you withhold your reaction, you don't just deprive the ego of its validation, you also demonstrate that you are not subject to its control. You show that you are above the ego's need for validation and that you are not swayed by its attempts to manipulate the situation. This creates an invisible shift in the power dynamics, where the ego's influence is diminished simply by not participating in its game. As a result, the more you deny the ego the reactions it craves, the more you empower yourself. You take back control over your emotions and actions, demonstrating that your sense of self-worth does not depend on external validation or approval. In doing so, you also help to neutralize the ego's effect on others. People who are constantly engaged with ego-driven behavior are often trapped in a cycle of conflict, competition, and comparison. And often, by not reacting to the ego, you also help to break this cycle, creating space for more peaceful, harmonious interactions. The ego's reliance on reactions is its greatest weakness. When you choose not to engage, not to react, you deprive it of the very thing that sustains it. The more you practice this approach, the more you realize that the ego cannot thrive without your participation. It is an illusion of power, one that falls apart when you stop feeding it. And in this realization, you not only weaken the ego, but also empower yourself, finding strength in your ability to remain unaffected by the external forces that seek to control your emotions and your sense of self. Grace and strength often present themselves in ways that are not immediately obvious. In a world where louder voices and bolder actions are frequently celebrated, it can be easy to overlook the quiet power that comes with restraint, patience, and self-control. Grace is not always about performing with ease or without effort, and strength is not solely measured by the ability to act forcefully or with aggression. In fact, true grace and strength are often found in the moments when we choose not to react, when we choose not to let external forces dictate our emotions or behavior. When faced with conflict, confrontation, or any situation that challenges our peace of mind, the typical response might be to defend ourselves, to argue, or to prove our point. This is the natural instinct. It's human nature to want to assert ourselves, to stand up for what we believe in, and to be heard. But what if we chose not to respond? What if, in the face of provocation or pressure, we responded with silence or calm instead of words or actions? This decision, difficult as it may be, reveals a deeper, more powerful kind of grace and strength. Grace is often seen as the ability to remain poised and composed, even under pressure. It is the quality that allows a person to handle difficult situations with dignity and patience. This type of grace does not require attention or applause. It is simply a reflection of inner peace and emotional maturity. True grace is not about putting on a facade of perfection or pretending that everything is fine when it is not. It is about maintaining your sense of self, regardless of what is happening around you, and choosing not to let external circumstances affect your inner calm. When someone with an inflated ego challenges or provokes you, responding with grace means choosing not to engage in the power struggle rather than feeding into the conflict with your own reaction. Grace allows you to step back and observe the situation with clarity. This decision to remain poised and not to react immediately demonstrates a deep understanding of the dynamics at play. You realize that engaging with the ego's behavior will only prolong the cycle, perpetuating the very thing that you seek to avoid. Grace is the understanding that your response or lack thereof speaks louder than words. Sometimes by doing nothing, you create the greatest impact. Strength, on the other hand, is often misunderstood as the ability to dominate or overpower others. In many cultures, strength is equated with power, loudness, and the capacity to control a situation. However, true strength is not about forcing your will on others or winning every argument. True strength lies in the ability to stay grounded, composed, and unaffected by the external chaos around you. It is the strength to remain calm in the face of aggression, the strength to hold your ground without raising your voice, and the strength to remain unmoved by the emotional turbulence that others may project onto you. When ego-driven individuals seek to provoke or challenge you, it can be tempting to respond with anger or frustration. The instinct to defend yourself or assert your point of view can feel like the right thing to do. However, true strength lies in the ability to hold your ground without being pulled into the emotional whirlwind that others create. Responding with grace means having the strength to choose silence or composure in moments of chaos. It is an active decision to remain undisturbed by external provocation. In moments of conflict, strength is not always about winning or proving yourself right. Sometimes the greatest strength comes from the ability to step back, to resist the urge to retaliate, and to maintain your peace of mind despite the situation. Strength is the ability to rise above the noise and to remain centered, even when the world around you is spinning. It is the strength to preserve your energy, to not waste it on things that don't serve your growth or well-being. Strength is not about fighting battles that don't need to be fought, and it is not about engaging in conflicts that don't align with your values. By choosing grace and strength, you demonstrate a level of self-control that is rare and deeply impactful. In a world that often prizes immediate reactions and quick resolutions, choosing to remain calm and composed is an act of resistance. It challenges the conventional notion that the only way to assert yourself is through forceful action or loud words. Instead, it shows that you can be just as powerful, if not more so, by withholding unnecessary responses and choosing peace over conflict. Grace and strength are also reflected in how we navigate relationships with others. Ego-driven individuals may seek to control conversations, assert dominance, or belittle others. Responding with grace in these situations means not lowering yourself to their level. It means refusing to engage in power struggles, refusing to play the game they want you to play. Instead of reacting defensively or trying to prove your worth, you demonstrate self-respect by simply refusing to engage with their behavior. You are not validating their need for control by participating in their drama. Instead, you rise above it, and in doing so, you model a higher standard of interaction. Silence has an incredible ability to expose the fragility of ego. The ego is a complex part of our psyche, often defined by a need for external validation, recognition, and the constant reinforcement of one's sense of self-worth. It thrives on attention and will do anything to ensure that it is noticed, often using external circumstances, interactions, and even other people as a way to amplify itself. Whether through loud words, gestures, or behaviors, the ego constantly demands to be the center of attention. It operates from a place of insecurity, using the validation from others as a crutch to feel powerful and significant. When you withhold reaction, especially in the face of ego-driven behavior, the ego is left to confront its own emptiness. Without the usual external validation, it begins to unravel and its weaknesses start to surface. This silence, this refusal to engage with the ego, shines a light on its true nature. Fragile and dependent. The ego is constantly seeking affirmation, and when it is not given the attention it seeks, it has no foundation to stand on. The more it is ignored, the more vulnerable it becomes, unable to sustain itself without the energy provided by external reactions. In these moments of silence, the ego is faced with its own dependence on validation. It's like a performer on stage, desperately seeking applause. But instead of receiving cheers, there is nothing but a quiet room. The ego begins to question itself. If I am not being recognized, am I still important? If no one is reacting to my words or actions, what does that say about me? This is the true fragility of ego. It cannot survive without external reinforcement. The more it seeks attention and is met with silence, the more it begins to lose its grip. Its perceived power starts to dissolve, and what once seemed like an invincible force becomes something far less substantial. The act of withholding a reaction, particularly in situations where one is provoked or challenged by an inflated ego, serves as a reminder of the ego's dependency on others. In many cases, the ego thrives on conflict. It enjoys stirring up emotions, creating tension, and engaging others in debates or arguments. When you choose to remain silent, you take away its power. You deny it the conflict it seeks, and without that conflict, the ego is exposed for what it truly is, an insecure, attention-seeking part of the self that crumbles when it cannot feed on external validation. Ego often disguises itself in many forms: arrogance, superiority, entitlement, but at its core, it is fragile. It is a construct that exists only because we, as individuals, continue to feed it with our reactions, our emotions, and our engagement. The ego needs to feel important, to feel noticed, and when it is not given the reactions it craves, it begins to falter. The silence that you offer in response to ego-driven behavior is the key to revealing this fragility. The longer you remain unaffected, the more the ego is forced to confront its own hollowness. Silence not only exposes the fragility of the ego, but it also forces it to reflect. When there is no external affirmation, the ego is left to turn inward. The usual game of external validation no longer works, and the ego must ask itself difficult questions. Why am I seeking validation? What happens when I am not recognized? What does that say about my worth? These questions are often too uncomfortable for the ego to address, and so it continues its quest for attention. But the longer it is denied the satisfaction of external reactions, the more it is forced to confront the emptiness within. It starts to realize that it cannot fill its own void with the praise and attention of others. Without silence, the ego would continue on its cycle of seeking recognition, but in the face of silence, its true vulnerability is revealed. In many ways, silence becomes a mirror to the ego. When someone behaves from a place of ego, they are often looking for a reflection of themselves in the eyes of others. They want to see themselves as powerful, important, or deserving of admiration. Silence forces them to look inward and confront the truth about themselves without the mirror of external validation. It is a humbling experience. The ego may try to justify its behavior or shift blame elsewhere, but the silence you offer leaves no room for such defenses. It simply holds up a mirror and forces the ego to see itself without the distortions of praise, validation, or attention. This mirror effect is particularly powerful in situations where the ego has tried to dominate a conversation or interaction. The ego seeks to control the narrative, to impose its own view, and to be the loudest voice in the room. But when that voice is not met with a response, when it is not validated, it loses its force. It is like shouting into an empty void. The words have no impact, no resonance. The ego, which once thought it had control over the situation, is left with nothing but silence. It begins to realize that without the reaction it sought, it has no control at all. When you offer silence in the face of ego, you also demonstrate a profound level of inner strength. It takes strength to remain calm and composed, to not let the words or actions of others provoke a reaction. This silence is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of inner peace and self-assurance. The ego, however, cannot understand this. It interprets silence as rejection, and in doing so, it exposes its own fragility. The more you remain silent, the more the ego is forced to confront its own dependence on external reactions. Silence is a powerful tool for revealing the fragility of ego. It exposes the emptiness that the ego tries to hide behind its loudness and dominance. In the absence of reactions, the ego is left to confront itself, its insecurities, and its need for validation. By withholding your reactions and choosing silence, you take away the power the ego relies on. The longer this silence persists, the more the ego crumbles under the weight of its own fragility. And in this process, you not only diminish the ego, but also strengthen your own inner peace and sense of self. Ego is a powerful force that shapes much of human behavior. It drives individuals to seek recognition, to assert their own importance, and to compete with others in a constant battle for validation. Yet, despite its outward appearance of strength, the ego is incredibly fragile. Its foundation is built on the need for external affirmation, which can be easily disrupted when that affirmation is withheld. One of the most effective ways to weaken the ego is not through confrontation or direct challenge, but through silence. When you choose not to react to ego-driven behavior, you expose its inherent weakness and diminish its power. The ego thrives on attention. It wants to be seen, heard, and admired. It constantly seeks out opportunities to prove its worth, often by asserting superiority or engaging in power struggles with others. The ego feeds on admiration, recognition, and praise. When these things are absent, the ego begins to feel vulnerable. It starts to question its own value and significance. This is where silence becomes such a powerful tool. When you do not respond to the ego's attempts to provoke or gain your attention, you deprive it of the very thing it craves most, validation. Silence, in this context, is not merely the absence of words. It is a deliberate choice to not engage with the ego's need for recognition. It is a refusal to participate in the drama and conflict that the ego seeks to create. The ego is constantly trying to provoke a reaction, whether it's through insults, manipulation, or attempts to dominate conversations. By choosing silence, you deny it the response it needs to feel powerful. You break the cycle of dependence on external validation, leaving the ego without a foundation to stand on. One of the most profound effects of silence on the ego is that it forces the ego to confront itself. Ego-driven individuals are often seeking validation from the outside world because they are unable to find it within themselves. They rely on the opinions and reactions of others to reinforce their sense of worth. When these reactions are not forthcoming, they are left with a void. The silence you offer in response to their ego-driven behavior forces them to face this emptiness. They are left with no one to validate their sense of importance. And in this moment, the fragility of their ego becomes apparent. The act of withholding a reaction can be disorienting for the ego. It expects a certain response, whether it's admiration, anger, or even defensiveness. When these expected reactions do not materialize, the ego is left without its usual means of asserting control. It begins to feel powerless and uncertain. This discomfort forces the ego to either retreat or escalate its behavior in an attempt to provoke a response. However, when the silence continues, the ego is left with no other choice but to question its own methods. It realizes that its power is not as unshakable as it once believed. Without the constant reinforcement of external reactions, the ego becomes weaker and its control over the situation diminishes. In situations of conflict or confrontation, the ego often expects to be engaged in battle. It thrives on tension and struggle, feeding off the emotional reactions of others. Whether it's through verbal sparring, passive-aggressive behavior, or an overt display of dominance, the ego seeks to control the outcome of any interaction. But when you choose silence instead of participating in this dynamic, you rob the ego of the energy it needs to sustain itself. The silence you offer is a refusal to engage with the ego's need for validation through conflict. Instead of getting caught up in the power struggle, you remain unaffected by its attempts to draw you in. This refusal to participate is not a sign of weakness, but rather a demonstration of inner strength and self-control. Silence also allows you to maintain your own sense of peace and dignity. Engaging with an ego-driven person often means sacrificing your own emotional well-being in order to meet the demands of their inflated sense of self-importance. The ego wants to drag you into its world of constant validation and competition. But by choosing silence, you protect yourself from the emotional turmoil that comes with reacting to ego-driven behavior. You preserve your own energy and maintain your sense of self-worth independent of the external validation the ego seeks from you. When the ego is met with silence, it has no choice but to turn inward. It can no longer feed off the reactions it typically provokes from others. In the absence of external feedback, the ego begins to question itself. It is forced to confront the reality that it is not as powerful as it believes. This moment of reflection can be unsettling for the ego, as it begins to realize that its entire sense of self-worth is built on fragile ground. The silence strips away the false sense of power that the ego relies on, leaving it to confront its own insecurities and doubts. This process of silence, exposing the ego's fragility, is not just a personal transformation for the individual who chooses not to react. It also has a ripple effect on the people around them. By not engaging with the ego, you create a space where healthier interactions can take place. You show others that there is a way to respond to ego-driven behavior without getting caught in the cycle of validation and conflict. You model a different approach to relationships. One that is not based on the need to compete or prove oneself, but rather on mutual respect and understanding. In the long run, silence becomes a powerful weapon against the ego. The more you practice withholding your reaction, the more you strengthen your ability to remain unaffected by the ego's attempts to provoke or control. The ego can only hold power as long as it is fed by your reactions. When you stop feeding it, you take away its source of energy, and in doing so, you diminish its hold over your life. The ego's fragility becomes evident, and it no longer has the power to dictate your emotions or your sense of self. Instead, you regain control over your own thoughts, feelings, and actions, and you are no longer at the mercy of the ego's manipulations.